Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us From Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us From Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode.
It's not the way that you would expect a hearing for UN ambassador to work, and it shows us that this is an exile for Mike Waltz. This is not a place where he is going to be able to shape meaningful outcomes from the perspective of the Trump administration, but it does look to him, I think, like a place for him to maybe rehabilitate his reputation.
Welcome to Save Us From Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm a journalist and I run Global Dispatches, and To Save Us From Hell is a project of Global Dispatches.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international relations at Fordham University in New York, where I teach and I write and I do research about the United Nations.
So, Anjali, I am coming to you today from beautiful Aspen, Colorado, where every year Denzians from the National Security and International Affairs community congregate for a 4-day conference, the Aspen Security Forum. This is, I think, my fourth of these conferences in a row. I first started coming right after COVID, but this is my first one of the Trump era. And look, big picture, I always appreciate this conference because it gives me an opportunity to hear directly from very senior foreign policy and international affairs officials, particularly from the U.S. government. In past years, you've had people like the CIA director, the Secretary of State, combatant commanders from the U.S. military, really kind of senior national security officials. And, this conference tends to lean kind of on the hard security geopolitics side of things. There has been some UN adjacent participation in the past, like Linda Thomas Greenfield came a couple of years ago. But going into this conference this year, I was just kind of wondering what sort of participation the Trump administration may permit its senior officials to undertake. And it turns out that a day before the conference was supposed to start, so yesterday, Tuesday, the 15th, the Pentagon announced that all of the scheduled speakers from the Pentagon, including the combatant commanders from the Southern Command, the Indo-Pacific Command, they were no longer permitted to speak. Pete Hegseth, through a spokesperson, called all of us attending this conference Trump-hating globalists. So why should...
Sure.
Sure. Why should senior Pentagon officials participate? So that was kind of the wrench that was thrown into the schedule. But it really hasn't... It started last night, hasn't really kicked off yet. So I can't give you a good vibe on the ground, but this was an interesting wrinkle to start with the conference.
Well, they say disengagement starts at home, so...
There you go. But more to the point of this episode, Anjali, on the beautiful 3.5-hour drive out from Denver to Aspen, I pulled up my C-SPAN app on my iPhone and listened to the entirety of Mike Waltz's hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to be the United States ambassador to the United Nations. Now, a little background for those of you who are unaware. Mike Waltz, a congressman from Florida, became Donald Trump's short-serving national security advisor. He was pushed out of the job after Signalgate and has been kind of floundering, not in the administration, but he was either promoted or demoted, however you want to think of it. When he was pushed out of the job as national security advisor, Trump said that he would nominate him as the United States ambassador to the United Nations. So that's what brought him before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee July 15th. So, Anjali, I just want to kick it off to you. What are your top takeaways from the hearing?
Well, I've got three top line takeaways, I would say. The first is if I'm watching from the UN, then I'm probably thinking, this man, Mike Waltz, he sounds like something we've seen before here.
Hmm.
The way he talks about American foreign policy, the way he talks about the United Nations with a few wrinkles, obviously, because he is serving a different kind of administration, but he sounds like someone who could have served at the United Nations under George W. Bush.
Hmm.
He has that kind of foreign policy lens. He comes with the same kinds of specific animus towards particular parts of the UN's work, but he also comes with the idea that it is important to have a global forum, to engage with other world leaders, all of those things. That would be the first takeaway. He's going to, from the get go, be a hatchet man on some parts of the UN's work and a supporter of other kinds of UN's work. And he has clearly framed his own ambition in terms of making this job work.
I concur. I had the same
Yeah.
kind of top line takeaway that it was, in some respects, like a normal Republican appearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Like you could have heard
Yeah.
many of the same answers from any previous Republican nominee, save John Bolton back in the early 2000s, who really did
Yeah.
come in there with an ideological axe to grind. So, yes, I concur. Your second takeaway.
My second takeaway is that it also sounds like this man is not going to have the ear of the president. He sounds like a George W. Bush era Republican, but he, first of all, is getting a demotion. This is not a cabinet level position. Everything about the meeting betrayed that, including the fact that he was having a hearing alongside the nominated ambassadors to Sweden and Portugal.
Okay, I want to stop you there because exactly. So like I was listening to this on like the radio, so I didn't actually have the screen in front of me. And then I heard them introduce the ambassadors or the nominees for Portugal and Sweden. And I was like, that's odd. Typically, you would just have the UN ambassador take questions for 2 hours and not have kind of other random ambassadors as well in the mix in the same hearing.
Yeah.
And so, yes, that was certainly an oddity and also a demonstration of how the position of the United States ambassador to the UN in this administration is a demotion.
Right. And so, if we think about this in contrast to Elise Stefanik's hearing earlier this year, she was clearly going to be someone who had Donald Trump's ear. She had a cabinet level position. It was going to be a seat of some note for her and a way to shape US foreign policy in a meaningful way. Mike Waltz is up there answering questions with two people who don't know much about foreign policy, right? They're political appointees, they're key donors, key Republican Party officials who really don't know much about where they're going. At one point, we were treated to like a full page history of Swedish Americans read directly from the text into the camera. It's not the way that you would expect a hearing for UN ambassador to work. And it shows us that this is an exile for Mike Waltz. This is not a place where he is going to be able to shape meaningful outcomes from the perspective of the Trump administration, but it does look to him, I think, like a place for him to maybe rehabilitate his reputation.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to bring me, I think, to the third point, which is that with very few exceptions, I would say only Chris Van Hollen and Tim Kaine, no one in that room is actually prepared to address the global disruption that the United States is causing to aid international institutions and international agreements. The reason Mike Waltz can sound so normal, can sound like a George W. Bush appointee in that chamber, is because no one is asking him about the seismic shocks that the US has put into the international system by axing aid, by undermining the core goals of institutions. Not Republicans, not Democrats, not anyone in that room but those two senators acknowledge the extraordinary crisis these systems are in. And so Mike Waltz can go in and get a lot of questions about Signalgate and get a lot of questions about confronting China and get comparatively few questions about what it means to take this position in a world that the Trump administration is actively trying to reorder.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point, because oftentimes I watch these hearings equally for the kinds of questions that the senators will ask as the answers that the nominee is given. And I think the point you just made is really crucial and really important. I sort of expected Democrats to really just hammer on the whole Signalgate thing. And three of them did.
Mm-hmm.
Cory Booker, Chris Murphy, and Chris Coons. Although I will add a caveat that Chris Coons, I think, started with the whole Signalgate thing, but then tried to get to, a part of the point that you just made. He didn't get there all the way, but many of the Democrats' questions focused on the space that America's abandonment of international institutions give to China to assert themselves. And it comes on the heels of a report that Jeanne Shaheen, who I really do admire as a senator, she often asks very good substantive questions in these things. And she just released a report yesterday detailing the ways in which these seismic shifts that you described are giving an opportunity for China to assert itself. And the key kind of fundamental disconnect that Waltz was not able to answer, because it's an unanswerable question, was, I think, pointed to by Chris Coons, who said something, along the lines of, look, you're abandoning USAID, you're abandoning all of these international institutions, giving a space for China, yet you're saying that you want to confront China in all these forums and in all these spheres. What gives?
Yeah.
And there was no satisfactory answer for that.
There wasn't. And to be fair, as you said, Senator Shaheen out of the gate, she mentioned the report, and then she did point out the Trump administration's fundamental problem. They want to slash diplomatic budgets and U.S. contributions to the UN, but they also want to counter China. And she said that she knows, Mike Waltz knows, that this will mean international bodies will just become more dependent on China.
Mm-hmm.
And so, she said, put simply, we can't shape these organizations or even push for the reforms we want if we are not at the table. And she says she hopes that Mike Waltz will, make that effort, but also noted his role wouldn't be cabinet level.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the disconnect there is that, and I say this with respect for, the work she's done and the questions she asked, she knows that's not possible.
Mm-hmm.
She is saying that she knows that Mike Waltz knows. I'm sure he knows. He still serves in an administration that doesn't care. And that is a really hard shift for people who are longtime U.S. policymakers, longtime elected representatives to make. It's hard, I think, to be a senator and think it's actually not at all relevant what this guy thinks is correct.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, Mike Waltz often and throughout the hearing just deferred to Marco Rubio.
Yeah.
Typically, particularly when the U.S. ambassador to the UN is a cabinet level position, there's some bureaucratic tension between these two cabinet officials who ostensibly are in charge of a discrete aspect of U.S. foreign policy dealing with international institutions in the United Nations. And, you often saw, for example, in the first Trump administration, that manifest itself in leaks and chastisings between Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo. Mm-hmm. But in this instance, Waltz was very deferential to Marco Rubio, who sits, firmly atop him on the, Trump administration food chain.
Yeah.
The flip side of the kind of questions that Democrats were asking were the Republican-focused questions. And I would make maybe kind of 2 points here. One is that, as far as Senate committees go, the Foreign Relations Committee is a functioning one. I think Senator Jim Risch, though, I disagree with him on a lot of issues, handles that committee in a way that still, I think, reflects a level of Senate historic congeniality. So, to a certain extent, credit there. But when it came to the kinds of substantive questions the Republicans were asking, it was all Israel, 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 anti-Semitism, Israel, Israel, right, which is to be expected.
Right.
And, the answers from Waltz were not unexpected at all.
No, they were not unexpected. I think Francesca Albanese's name came up more than Antonio Guterres's
Yeah.
in the hearing as sort of the embodiment for the GOP and for Mike Waltz of their perceived problems at the United Nations.
Can you just, like, for listeners, just explain who she is and what, like, the kind of Republican knocks against her tend to be? I should say it's not just Republican. Yeah, she's a polarizing figure.
She is a polarizing figure, yeah. Francesca Albanese is the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. And, in that capacity, she's an independent official. She's an unpaid independent official who is appointed by the UN Human Rights Council to conduct independent investigations into the human rights situation in the Palestinian territories. And, she doesn't report to the UN Secretary General. She reports directly to the Human Rights Council. Her job is to be independent, and her job is to produce information about what is happening on the ground. She has been, as you say, a polarizing figure. I think in terms of the actual work she has produced, even member states that might find her figure to be sort of polarizing have been confident in the actual work that she has produced. She's been very vocal about calling the situation in Gaza a genocide. The latest report is one in which she highlights the role that private industry plays in supporting Israeli actions against civilians in Gaza. And as a result of that report, directly she has been sanctioned by the US State Department in an unprecedented move.
It's wild and unprecedented, as you said, so worth emphasizing that a UN human rights official is under sanction by the United States government for her work.
For her work, exactly, for her work, not for any sort of individual comments she might have made or anything like that. The direct citation is that she is attempting to prompt international criminal court action against US and Israeli officials, companies, and executives. That's what Secretary of State Marco Rubio tweeted out,
Mhm.
because that's how we do foreign policy now, tweeted out directly imposing sanctions on Francesca Albanese. And the role of independent rapporteur has been around since the 80s. As far as I can tell, this is the first time an independent human rights expert has been directly targeted in this way with sanctions. There have been other officials who have been designated as persona non gratas, not able to move around and do their work. That's because by nature, this work is confrontational.
Mhm.
The work of an independent expert, a special rapporteur, is actually to unearth information that many people do not want unearthed and to shine a light on it, right? In that way, the function of the role is to produce information that state parties often don't want made public and
Mhm.
don't want a light shined on. So it's not a surprise that these relationships have been confrontational in the past, but no one has directly sanctioned a UN independent expert for their work before.
Yeah, and she has become like the boogeyman
Yeah.
for a certain kind of criticism against the United Nations, saying that it's like anti-Semitic or unduly focused on Israel, but like literally her job is to focus on what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territories, which right now constitutes massive crimes against humanity and war crimes,
Yeah.
potentially to include genocide. So, she is getting criticized and sanctioned literally, for doing her job.
That's right. It's specifically her mandate to carry out this work. And other UN special rapporteurs have talked about how this creates a potentially chilling effect, how the ability of these experts to move around to do their work, to produce information by necessity that is confrontational, is threatened when a powerful state individually sanctions an expert trying to unearth this kind of information. And her role in this confirmation hearing was to serve as that, as you said, UN boogeyman,
Mhm.
to say, look at the moral rot at the UN. I think that is actually a phrase someone used at some point.
That was a free preview of our full episode. To unlock the episode, please go to globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription. We rely on your support to keep this show going. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Save Us From Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us From Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.